Righty. Hello, everybody. How are we all doing this wonderful Monday morning? I hope you all enjoyed the weekend and the good-ish weather that came along with it. I was lucky enough this weekend to see my remarkable friend Olivian, who I'll be cat-sitting for this very week. We went to this 50s-themed diner, and I had the best chicken fried steak of my life. I love a good fancy restaurant, don't get me wrong, but diners have my heart. The menu was legit Schitt's Creek size, and I promise I will be going back as many times as needed to try everything at least once. She brought up the fact that maybe pet sitting for her would possibly numb my itch for a pet, which is entirely true, and I hope is the case. But honestly, over the past few days, guys, it's just gotten worse. I swear I've never done this before, and last night I started scrolling through the cats that were available for adoption, like in every single town nearby. It's bad, but we'll see how the cat sitting goes. Obviously, I'm thrilled about it. Okay, enough about me. Today, I bring you the Marr family murders. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources for today's episode come from Murderpedia, Wikipedia, Historic England, and the rest I will put down below. Over the past, who knows how many episodes, I've been focusing a lot on Victorian-era crimes and unlikely detectives. So today I wanted to showcase the preceding era of British history. Just before the Victorians came the Georgian era, named for the string of King Georges, of course, stretching for over 100 years from 1714 to roughly 1830-ish. Technically, there lies a sub-era called the Regency period, lasting only 9 years from 1811 to 1820, but we don't need to get into all that. I think Bridgerton and a few of those other popular shows are placed right around there. According to Wikipedia, it was a time of immense social change in Britain, with the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, which began the process of intensifying these class divisions, and the emergence of rival political parties like the Whigs and the Tories. In more rural areas, the agricultural revolution saw huge changes to the movement of people and the decline of small communities, the growth of cities, and the beginnings of an integrated transportation system. But nevertheless, as small towns and villages declined and work became scarce, there was a huge increase in emigration to Canada, the North American colonies, and other parts of the British Empire. As much as the Victorians embraced death, the Georgian-era residents took full advantage of the arts. For example, you have Mozart and Beethoven among the most popular musicians of the time. Plus, there's Jane Austen and Daniel Defoe, both renowned writers. They developed their works throughout these years, just to name drop a few. That said, they did not shy away from good old crime and punishment. The Georgians loved enforcing capital punishment, so much so that they started condemning people to death for minor offenses like stealing. Thieves, murderers, and scammers alike were hung in public for everyone to see. Highway robberies were on the rise, and if you were lucky enough to avoid the gallows, make it to a prison, you might end up with a child cellmate. Yep, all children and adults were housed in the same cell blocks. Once you finished your sentence, the guards would make you pay a fee to go free. Sadly, many of these people and children were unable to pay and would end up staying there for years longer than they had to. According to readingmuseum.org, quote, transportation was a popular punishment in Georgian times. Prisoners were often given the option of execution or being banished to a faraway country for 1 year, 7 years, 14 years, or a lifetime. I mean, I would always choose that. At the end of their sentence, they were given a certificate of freedom, but few could afford to actually go back home. Hundreds of children, as young as 9 years old, they were transported to. From 1780-ish and on, most prisoners were sent to Australia. Many had committed petty crimes like stealing, and others were just workers who had gone on strike, which was illegal. Transportees, even children, wore a one-size uniform which was often too big. They were shackled together and locked in small cells together before their voyage. It took around 8 months to reach Australia. During this 8-month transportation, some of these prisoners were able to learn a trade, but most of them did unpaid hard labor and worked as servants once they reached the mainland. Oh, and many Georgian schools were harsh, corrupt, and simply didn't have enough teachers. Not surprisingly, students were badly disciplined and very unhappy. In 1797, boys of the rugby school took staff prisoner at sword point. And in 1818, during Winchester's Great Rebellion, boys armed with axes took their headmaster hostage. So that's basically the lowdown of the Georgian era. On a chilly December night, the Marr family prepped for the following day of business, December 8th, before closing their shop/home for the night. Located on Ratcliffe Highway in the East End of London, it was known for being a dilapidated area full of dark alleys, seedy businesses, and unfortunate characters. It was just before midnight when the shop owner, Timothy Marr, asked his, quote, servant, Margaret, to run out and purchase some oysters before they closed. Timothy's wife Celia, the shop boy James, and the Marrs' only child, Timothy Jr., remained in the shop. Margaret was away for only 20 minutes or so, but when she returned, everything was different. The shop door was locked and the lights had been turned off. Puzzled, she knocked, hoping they had simply made a mistake. Nothing. She knocked again as this eerie feeling began creeping over her. Margaret heard the stairs let out a squeak and then heard the cry of Timothy Jr. inside. Feeling comforted knowing someone would soon be at the door, she let out a sigh of relief. But no one came. And then another noise, this time from the shadows behind her. Margaret frantically banged on the shop's door, drawing attention from many nearby neighbors. According to Murderpedia, among them was George Olney, the night watchman who called out the time every half an hour. He came to find out what was happening, and Margaret explained her situation, so he himself knocked at the door. He noticed that the shutters, while in place, were not latched, which was a concern. He called out several times to Timothy Marr, who he did know very well, but he too received no response. All of this noise awoke John Murray, a pawnbroker and the next-door neighbor, from his sleep. He came to find out what this ruckus was all about, so Margaret explained again that she had been locked out. Murray grew concerned, so he vaulted over the wall that divided his yard from the Marrs and saw a light on and the back door standing wide open. He entered, went up the stairs, calling out softly to the Marrs that they had neglected to fasten their shutters and forgot Margaret outside. He heard nothing. In fact, the house felt unnaturally quiet. A chill had gripped him, but he was uncertain as to how much more action he should take. Quote, returning downstairs and entering the shop, Murray beheld the carnage of the night stretched out on the floor. The narrow premises were floated with gore that it was hardly possible to escape the pollution of blood in picking out a path to the front door. First, he saw young James Gowan, the apprentice. He was lying on the floor a man's height from the stairs and just inside the shop door. As Murray approached, he could see that someone had smashed the bones of the boy's face, pulverizing his brain and causing it to be cast about all around the walls and even across the counters. Murray turned to the front door to let Olney in, but he stumbled across yet another corpse. He saw Mrs. Marr face down, her head battered in as well, and blood still dribbling from her wounds. Murray ran to the door, and with Olney, he searched for Timothy. Behind the shop counter, they found him battered to death. With 3 people dead inside the residence, concern turned to the baby. Murray and Olney rushed to the living quarters in the basement and found the child. Whoever had violated the others had also finished young Timothy as well. The boy was still in his bed, clearly wounded from a blow to the head that had also cut open his mouth. One side of his face was crushed in, and his throat was slit, with the head nearly severed from the body. The crib itself covered in blood. Those who found him were stunned by these deeds. By this time, more people from the neighborhood had gathered outside, and some of them even entered the home. They held their candles up, looking for a murder weapon and gawking at these poor victims. All before one person ran to the River Thames police office to summon assistance. Officer Charles Horton was the single responding authority figure. Nothing in his previous career could have prepared him for what lay beyond that entryway. Horton lit a dim lamp and began a meticulous search of the previously described horror scene. Apart from the bodies, nothing seemed out of place on the ground floor besides a clean chisel not in place. The same came from the baby's room. Lots of blood, but no murder weapon. As he moved upstairs, he was joined by Olney. They entered Marr's bedroom and found the bed undisturbed. Against a chair, they found a heavy hammer, or a maul, covered in blood and matted hair. Horton seized the hammer as evidence and continued his search, during which he discovered a bunch of money in the bedroom drawer. So if the motive for the murder were burglary, then it would appear that the suspects had fled the scene empty-handed, possibly scared away when Margaret had started to knock. 2 sets of bloodstained footprints led away from the scene, and a possible witness down on Pennington Street reported that he had seen a group of men, maybe 10, running away from the empty house in the direction of New Gravel Lane, or Glamis Road nowadays, shortly after that first alarm had been raised. After Horton returned to the station, exhausted and presumably traumatized, the investigation officially began. For 2 weeks, police arrested people of interest frequently, like almost once per day, but none of those people were held for more than a few hours. It wouldn't be until December 19th that the case saw its first real breakthrough. And this should have been discovered like day 2, but a very belated examination of this maul or hammer revealed a set of stamped initials, JP. So none of the Marr's family, none of their employees. It was brought in from somewhere else. Just as the police were getting their feet underneath themselves in this investigation, the worst possible thing happened. Quote, that same evening on December 19th, the town of Wapping was once more thrown into turmoil when yet another gruesome murder scene came to light. John Williamson, his wife Elizabeth, and their barmaid Bridget Harrington were found murdered at the King's Arms Tavern on New Gravel Lane. The murders were discovered when a patrolling watchman found a man, John Turner, who was lodging at the tavern, climbing or scrambling half naked down these knotted sheets from an upper floor and shouting that murder was being committed within the house. Entry was gained to the premises by forcing open the cellar door, and a rapid search revealed the body of John Williamson hanging from a ladder in the cellar, and the bodies of his wife and their barmaid Bridget in the kitchen area. All 3 had been brutally battered and murdered. It also appeared that their throats had been cut in what appeared to be almost a carbon copy of the recent atrocities involving the Marr family. There were further similarities to the Marr murders in the supposed method of escape, which appeared to be across open land at the rear of the premises. Only one other person, other than the Turner guy, climbing naked, survived the attack. Kitty Stillwell, the Williamsons' 14-year-old granddaughter, who had slept through the incident and had thus escaped being found by the murderers. End quote. The public was once again thrown into a state of panic, and police felt the immense pressure mounting exponentially. According to Wikipedia, a principal suspect in the murders, John Williams, also known as John Murphy, was a 27-year-old Irish or Scottish seaman and a lodger at the Pear Tree, which was a public house down on Cinnamon Street off of a highway in Old Wapping. Williams' roommate had noticed that he had returned after midnight on the night of the tavern murders. A man by the name of Thomas De Quincey claimed that Williams had been an acquaintance of Timothy Marr, and he described him as a man of middle status, slenderly built, but with the most extraordinary hair, a vivid orangish yellow color. On December 24th, more than 2 weeks after the Marr family had been murdered, and 5 days after the killing of the Williamson family, the mall was finally identified as belonging to a sailor named John Peterson, who was away at sea during the time. The information was volunteered up by Mr. Vermilyeau, the landlord of the Pear Tree. This man was currently incarcerated in the Newgate prison for debt, so constables searched the premises and found Peterson's trunk, which was missing a maul. Vermilyeau recalled that not only had the maul been in the chest, but that he himself had used it and was responsible for previously chipping it. And this was a significant lead. Before an open forum of witnesses that day, Christmas Eve, Turner, the man who escaped screaming murder, was asked if he could identify John Williams as the man that he had seen standing over Mrs. Williams that night. He could not, but he did state that he knew Williams from earlier visits to the tavern. Williams' laundress was called in to see if she had washed any bloody clothing. She said that 2 weeks earlier, she had noticed that one of his shirts was torn and that another had blood around the collar, as if he was scratching at it with bloody fingers. She assumed that John Williams had just been in a fight and had not washed any more clothing for him since before the Williamsons were murdered. I'm sorry if that's confusing. There's the Williamsons murdered, the family, and then John Williams is the man they are investigating. John Williams claimed that the torn and bloodstained shirts were the result of a brawl after a card game, but he was silenced by the magistrates. The facts and evidence against Williams was that he had an opportunity to take the mall at the Pear Tree, that he had money after the murders but not before, according to some of his associates, and that he had returned to his room just after the killer had fled the second crime scene. On top of that, you have the circumstantial evidence of the bloody and torn clothes. And we have to keep in mind, back in hundreds of years ago, they could not use any forensic evidence, and a great weight was put on eyewitnesses' statements at the time. As Williams became this favored suspect in the recent killings, a trial date would soon be set. However, not everyone was satisfied. Some people believed investigators were using this man as a scapegoat. But we will never know for sure because on December 28th, just days later, Williams was found dead in his cell due to an apparent suicide. Quote, "No one discovered this until just before he was to be taken for another hearing before Shadwell magistrates. An officer announced to the court that the accused was dead and his body was cold. Williams' suicide surprised everyone who had spoken to him in the days leading up to this event. Multiple prisoners and a warden said that he had appeared to be in good spirits only the day before, believing that he would soon be exonerated and released. This led to more speculation that Williams was murdered to prevent authorities from looking elsewhere." End quote. His death, however, didn't stop officials from moving forward. They held a hearing and declared John Williams guilty of murder, taking his suicide as a statement of guilt, and even though all of the evidence surrounding him only connected to the second attack of the Williamsons, he was deemed guilty of both. Quote, "On New Year's Eve, John Williams' body was removed from the prison at 11 a.m. with an immense concourse of people, said to total over 180,000, to take part in a procession up this Ratcliffe Highway. When the cart carrying the body came opposite the Marr family home, the procession halted for nearly 15 minutes, and people created many drawings and artworks of that moment. Whether or not John Williams was guilty or simply someone to place the blame on, his story came to an end with thousands of people cheering for his death. And that, my friends, is the story of the Marr family murders, and also the Williamsons family too. I hope you all enjoyed today's Georgian era tale. Thank you all once again for taking the time out of your day each week to listen in. It truly means the world. As always, stick around for a bit extra after the music. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you. Woohoo! We did it, guys. 69 episodes. Way to go. I struggled to find a good story to fit here today. Not that I themed these back to back at all, but there is so much more to learn about crime and punishment in the Georgian era, and I just wanted to explore that further. So, if you didn't like the tidbit we did in the beginning, titled Gruesome Georgians by Historic England. Quote, in Georgian England, crime was rife. Over 200 offenses were punishable by death. Of course, including murder, rape, but then you have arson, forgery, and sheep stealing. A gruesome, painful, and humiliating demise was often favored by the high courts. Many buildings and structures related to Georgian crime and punishment survive today, and numerous are listed as fine examples of this Georgian architecture, as well as for their place in the fascinating history of our justice system. Fascinating and terrifying history. The debtors' prison, built in 1701, and the adjoining women's prison were home to a number of notorious inmates, including legendary highwayman Dick Turpin, who was tried and sentenced to death there in 1739. Turpin was hanged at Tyburn in New York, and the gravestone that reputably marks his location still remains at nearby Fishergate. Another inmate of note at that prison was Elizabeth Boardingham, who was burned at the stake in York in 1776. Elizabeth was frustrated with her increasingly unreliable husband, who frequently served prison sentences, leaving her alone to look after their children. She pressured her lover at the time, Thomas Akeney, to kill John, for which he obliged, stabbing him in the chest at their family home. Akeney was sentenced to death by hanging, but for her part in the murder, Elizabeth was dealt a harsher sentence. It was thought that in her plotting, Elizabeth had disrupted the natural hierarchy, which ranked men above women, and so was charged with treason rather than murder, and sentenced to burn at the stake. What a thought process on that one. She was the last person to be executed in this way in Yorkshire. Newgate Prison, which we have talked a little bit about before and has a fascinating history, this place had countless public hangings and served as thrilling entertainment for the morbidly curious crowds. From 1783, the public executions at London's main prison, Newgate, drew huge crowds before they were moved inside to an execution yard. The last person to be publicly executed in Britain was Michael Barrett, who was hanged at Newgate Prison for his supposed part in a bomb attack in Clerkenwell in 1868. Nowadays, the site of Newgate Prison houses the Old Bailey or Central Criminal Court, which was rebuilt after the Great Fire of London. Unlike our modern-day organized police force, in the 18th century, local law enforcement was left to elected volunteer constables in each parish. Unsurprisingly, this was largely ineffective. Criminals convicted of lesser crimes were fined or shamed in public, which, if you watch Game of Thrones, we know very well about that. Stocks and whipping posts have been used internationally throughout history and were very popular in Georgian times as a form of physical punishment and humiliation. Low-level criminals were likely left tied by the wrists or bound by the ankles to be pelted with rotten vegetables by their fellow townspeople. Notorious highwaymen were the celebrities of the Georgian era. Their tales of daring escapes passed in whispers through towns and villages. One such criminal, Jack Shepherd of Spitalfields, London, was known to have been caught for thievery and escaped prison at least 4 times over the course of his career. The 5th and final time he was arrested, Jack was sentenced to hang at Tyburn, a location close to what is now known as the Marble Arch in London. Executions at this Tyburn started in the early 12th century and would continue up until the 1780s. They were known for hanging up to 20 people at a time. When Jack Shepherd was transported to his gallows at Tyburn, a procession followed with crowds of over 200,000 people, 1/3 of London's population at the time. Jack stopped for a sherry on the way to his execution, where his autobiography was also on sale. End quote. And that, my friends, is every single thing you need to know about the 100 years of the Georgian era. I hope you did find some of that interesting. I love, and I love how much these people love death. Again, I truly think I would have fit in wonderfully well in this era. But that is all, and I will let you folks know how the cat sitting goes. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you.